In the last 30 years, the population of Asia has increased by more than 1 billion people. Before the end of the century, it is expected to increase by 1 billion more. It was in anticipation of this staggering rate of population growth that scientists began to develop higher-yielding varieties of cereal crops in the 60s. In many Asian countries, researchers cooperated with IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute, located in the Philippines, to produce new varieties of rice. In addition to a high yield potential, they developed varieties which will mature early and in a fixed number of days, no matter when they are planted. Whereas traditional varieties of rice will only flower when the day reaches a certain length, many of these new short-term varieties are photoperiod insensitive. This means they will flower regardless of the day length. They can be planted at any time of year, as long as there is sufficient water. This makes these varieties more flexible and adaptable to different cropping patterns. IRRI has helped to introduce these new strains of rice to many Asian countries, such as Sri Lanka, where local scientists have developed the best varieties to suit their own climates and tastes. But early in the process, researchers learned that success on a research station was no guarantee of success in farmers' fields. IDRC, the International Development Research Center of Canada, joined forces with IRRI and scientists in many countries to find a way of developing new production techniques that are within the reach of the people. Sri Lanka is the site of one of the experiments. For over 2,000 years, the people of Sri Lanka have farmed their land, and 70% of them are still involved in agriculture today. And the most precious input in this activity is water. More than 1,000 years ago, much of Sri Lanka was covered by great irrigation systems. During the reign of the great kings of Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa, this country was an exporter of rice. Its history records how some of these rulers developed strict laws on the use of water for agriculture. But these kingdoms and their great works crumbled. Today, beside the remains of ancient dams, new ones are being constructed. History is repeating itself. The harnessing of the rivers of Sri Lanka is an enormous attempt to rebuild a large part of the country. New rice paddies are gradually covering land which has not been used for centuries. These irrigation schemes may eventually supply sufficient water to allow at least 2 crops per year on thousands of acres of paddy land. However, a large area of the dry zone will never receive this water. It was in this area, just beyond the reach of the irrigation scheme, that Sri Lankan researchers decided to conduct their experiment. Much of the land in this part of Sri Lanka is covered by scrub forest. But more than 15 centuries ago, thousands of rain-fed irrigation tanks were constructed, allowing rice to be cultivated in this region. With the end of the Great Kingdoms, however, many of these reservoirs fell into disrepair. And later, colonial rulers placed more emphasis on export crops such as tea and spices, rubber and coconut. The dry zone rice farmer was left to his own devices. Reservoirs dried up and scrub jungle took over. The tank village of Walagumbahua is one site where traditional agricultural practices have not been abandoned. It is a typical dry zone settlement of 45 families. Here, farmers have grown rice throughout the 15 centuries since their reservoir was constructed. However, in the 7 years of low rainfall before the researchers came to the village, the paddy lands below the tank had produced nothing. Farmers, therefore, had put their energy into cultivating the chaina, the cleared uplands around the tank. This is a traditional practice which begins with slashing and burning. After an area of chaina has been cleared, it will support upland crops such as chili and finger millet. Grain legumes such as cowpeas, green gram, and black gram add needed protein to the villagers' diets. These crops require much less water than rice, and together with small home gardens have sustained the villagers over the years. However, this system depends on a very long fallow time after each short period of cultivation. Population pressure is gradually reducing this fallow time, resulting in severe damage to the soil. At Walagumbahua, the researchers analyzed this threefold system of agriculture: the paddy lands below the tank, the chaina, and the home gardens. They recommended that one way to ease the pressure on the chaina and increase the living standard of the small farmers was to improve the productivity of the paddy lands. To do this, changes had to be made in the system because the villagers were not making full enough use of the monsoon rains that fell each year. The farmers had to be convinced that a change in the system was necessary. They did not automatically accept the new ideas put to them. During the first years of the experiment, some of the researchers and their assistants lived in the village in order to fully understand the situation. To increase the chance that the farmers would adopt the results, they were invited to become partners in the research. They supplied the land and labor and were free to reject any idea they felt would not help them. Many gave their own suggestions. Their advice was important, for it was they who had lived with the fluctuating levels of water in their village reservoir. The key to change lay in the use of the maha, the northeast monsoon rains that start in October each year. Before the research began, water falling on the fields at this time of year was wasted. Farmers knew that this rainwater would not be sufficient to sustain their traditional varieties of rice, so they waited for the tank to fill before deciding to sow. The research team believed that the new rice varieties had a role to play here. They analyzed the 70-year record of rainfall in the area and concluded that the farmers could plant the new varieties much earlier, just as the rains begin. The maha rains would usually provide enough water to bring the new varieties to maturity in January. Meanwhile, throughout the maha period, the tank fills, gathering enough rainfall most years to irrigate a second crop. This crop is sown in early March to take advantage of the lighter southwest monsoons, the yala. With this second crop and the use of the new varieties, the farmers doubled their income from crop production in the village in the first year of the research. The experiment continued, and today the new cropping system is firmly established. During the dry season, in July and August, the farmers prepare the chaina for the planting of upland crops as usual. Unless the rains have been particularly good, the paddy lands remain fallow during these months while animals graze and fertilize the soil. In October, when the maha rains begin, the paddy lands are plowed and sown with the new varieties of rice. Around the same time, the chaina and home gardens are planted with upland crops and vegetables. In late January, after these rains have ended, the crops are harvested. And the tank is full, ready for a second crop. When the rice harvest is completed, animals are allowed onto the land once more during a short turnover period. This grazing also helps to control weeds. Meanwhile, in the chaina and home gardens, the harvest is over. Around March, the paddy land is planted in time to take advantage of the yala rains from the southwest. Since these rains are not sufficient to bring a rice crop to maturity, the tank sluice is opened. The choice and extent of crops planted in this season depends on the amount of water left in the tank from the maha rains. If there is not enough water in the tank for a full crop of rice, a combination of rice and upland crops, such as sorghum, cowpeas, and soybeans, can be grown. Rice on the heavy soils and upland crops on the lighter, well-drained soils. At this time, sesame, a drought-resistant cash crop, is grown in the chaina. All of these crops are harvested in June when the dry season has begun again. But in a good year, if the rains have been plentiful and enough water remains in the tank, a third crop of grain, legumes, and vegetables can be grown on part of the paddy lands. When these crops mature and are harvested, there is another short turnover period, and then the cycle begins again. The implementation of a new system of cropping at Walagambahua was much more complicated than simply handing farmers new varieties of rice. In addition to baseline surveys before the project began, research assistants conducted daily interviews and monitored the allocation of village labor throughout the cropping cycle. From these interviews, they determined that there was no conflict between labor demands of the Chena and the paddylands. There were normally enough family members to work both areas at the same time. Many other things were tested in the different soil conditions encountered in the fields of Walagambahua. Several tillage methods were tried out. Some farmers acquired small two-wheel tractors and contracted their services to others. For experimental purposes, four-wheel tractors were used, but the cost of operation was found to be too expensive for the farmers. Although some farmers had their own buffalo, others had to rent a team on a daily basis, and there was generally a shortage of animals at plowing time. To offset this shortage, farmers were advised to train more buffalo and cattle to till the land. Practices such as new row seeding techniques, which entail more labor, were not readily accepted by the farmers who preferred to broadcast their rice. But weeds in broadcast rice are usually controlled chemically, increasing the cost of production. Weeding in row-seeded rice can be done manually, and farmers will likely adopt this method when the appropriate tools become more readily available. There were some outbreaks of insect pests and diseases. However, the farmers adopted a wait-and-see attitude rather than spending money on chemical control. The research team advised that these problems could be minimized by the use of resistant varieties and proper planting times that do not correspond with the life cycles of insects. The farmers' attitude towards the use of fertilizer was similar. Although various trials were made with basal fertilizers, farmers were only prepared to top-dress their rice. They did not want to risk spending money on fertilizer until they were assured of a successful crop. But alongside crops without fertilizer, some interested farmers cooperated in rice trials which clearly demonstrated to the community the difference that a few inputs, such as fertilizers, can make. The choice was theirs. But by following the new planting schedule, the farmers experienced a substantial increase in household income in the second year, an increase due to the doubling of crop production on their paddylands over the previous year. With these gains already, it was difficult to convince many farmers that they could do even better by spending more money on inputs. Years of living very close to the survival line had made them cautious about any decision that involves more work and money, and their caution was respected. However, it was felt that as the farmers became more confident in their new cropping system and wealthier because of it, they would begin to use more inputs and adopt newer agricultural practices. These would help to stabilize the whole system, including the Chena. The researchers recorded what the villagers ate both before and after the new cropping system was instituted. No longer did the families have to spend money on the purchase of rice. And there was a marked increase in the amount of protein foods consumed in the village. Other signs of newly found wealth also appeared in Wallagambahua. Would the villagers carry on with the new practices in their paddy lands when the research team left? This would depend upon the ability of the people to work together and decide on a mutually acceptable program and timetable for cultivation. The researchers saw the need for stronger leadership in the village and better defined roles for government extension workers. Land tenure problems presented one of the greatest barriers to progress. Over the years, the land has been subdivided, sold, and traded into an inefficient patchwork. Families have to work small plots of land in different locations. This problem remains to be solved. The researchers also recommended that the changes to the system should be supported by improved organization in the village cooperative store and a better credit and repayment scheme for farmers. In spite of these constraints, other areas were chosen for the new cropping system. The researchers were able to bring with them a tested package of technology for many types of soil. In Sri Lanka, there are about 3,000 of these tank-based villages and an additional 7,000 smaller tanks which may benefit from the findings. Someday, the new methods could reach 250,000 acres of paddy land in the dry zone. This combination of new and ancient technology is helping to bring a stable food supply to Sri Lankans, many of whom are moving into the dry zone because of population pressures. Already, the system has been implemented in many villages, and plans have been made for spreading the concept to hundreds more. The cropping system's approach is not limited to tank-based agriculture in Sri Lanka. It is being refined at numerous locations in Asia through a network of research groups that has been established with the help of IDRC and IRI. Younger researchers are being trained to help bring this new cropping technology to farmers' fields in a wide variety of microclimates and soil conditions. The water sources available and types of crops grown with rice vary from country to country. But the basic purpose in the research remains the same as in Sri Lanka, to help farmers find new production techniques which are within the resources available to them. Tools which will improve their quality of life without upsetting the best traditions of the past. Traditions such as the ceremony after the harvest at Wallagambahua, a ceremony which is held much more often these days.
කල්විලමල් පකුණ බලා වැඩසට දෙවතා කළු දෙවතා සමග වඩිනු ගමේ දේවතා ඇතත් වරද සාමිනේ මට කරුණා කරතා ඇතෙක්සේම ගම් කඩයින් බාරව සිටිතා මතකලේ කරුණාවක් ගණ්ඩ වැඳයිතා කොතෙක් වරද ඇතත් වඩිනු ගමේ දේවතා